At Antarctic latitudes, beyond the safety of the continents, lies a solitary island. Here, the furious, incessant winds and an icy ocean, the most violent in the world, test the resistance of species and deter visitors accustomed to the comforts of civilization. Strange destinies have marked its history and that of man. There was a time of darkness, of despair, but there was also place for honor, dignity, and glory. It is a harsh, violent island, solitary, cold, and rocky. But perhaps precisely for these reasons, it was the place chosen for the eternal rest by heroes. And also perhaps why many Antarctic species seek out these coasts on which to perpetuate life below the 50th parallel, performing the miracle, turning the austerity and harshness of this island on the edge of the Antarctic into the setting for an explosion of life. To the south of the continents, beyond the lands inhabited by man, lies a region dominated by the rigors of the climate. No other place on Earth is drier, colder, or windier than the Antarctic. Around it, frozen winds violently blow, their forces combining with circular currents to create a region of terrible turbulences. There, beneath this climatological whirlwind, hides South Georgia, an insignificant patch of land, but vital for the birds and mammals of the Antarctic region. All the waters that surround the Antarctic are very rich in nutrients. Enormous quantities of plankton feed on these nutrients, forming the basis of a chain of life which ends with the thousands of marine mammals and birds that inhabit the ocean around the frozen continent. The different species of seals and birds can feed wherever they want in the enormous Antarctic Ocean. But when the time comes to reproduce, they need solid land free from ice, and that in the extreme south can only be found on some small islands, the most important of which is South Georgia. Even without ice, life on Georgia is not easy. The winds that blow around latitude 50 degrees south are so violent and persistent that they are known as the Furious Fifties. In this bleak land, life is a constant struggle for survival, a permanent test of strength against the ferocious wind which steals the precious body heat. And yet, in the course of the year, the coasts of Georgia are visited by true specialists in combating the cold. It is the end of the Antarctic winter, and the female elephant seals have already started to bring their young into the world. The mother's milk is so rich in fats that their pups gain 9 kilos a day. The males, too, have arrived on South Georgia. These giants, weighing almost 4,000 kilos, need no other protection but their fat in order to survive in the frozen latitudes of the extreme south. And so they take over the edge of the beach, not at all concerned at how exposed it is to the freezing southwest wind. The females become receptive again after giving birth and will now mate once more. Though the climate does not impose restrictions, the need for solid ground does. There are few available beaches, and from the start of the breeding season, each plot of land has its owner. And as the season advances, that will bring problems. As the climate becomes milder between the months of August and November, the beaches of the northern coast of the island are increasingly in demand. The Gentoo penguins came here at the end of the winter, and by the time the Antarctic spring arrives, they've already begun laying their eggs. Protecting an egg on a barren beach battered by the wind is not an easy task. So the Gentoo penguins have to build resistant nests, and for this, they use the only material available: stones. After making a pile of grass and moss on which to place the egg, the Gentoo penguins fortify their nest with pebbles. This laborious task, piling up to 1,700 pebbles per nest, protects the precious eggs from the wind. But the wind is not the Gentoo penguins' only enemy. The presence of a brown skua raises the alarm in the colony. The skuas know that each nest contains vital energy in the form of eggs, and they have become expert thieves. They constantly harangue the penguins, just waiting for one false move, an opportunity to steal the eggs. But they run the danger of a sharp peck which could kill them, so they've perfected their technique and usually attack in pairs. A synchronized attack minimizes the risks and increases the effectiveness. Each skua attacks on one side, and while one dodges the penguin's rebuttal, the other one grabs the egg. The penguins' eggs and chicks are a vital resource for the survival of the brown skuas. And for the Gen 2, the problem is not too serious, because they lay 2 eggs at a time, and even if they lose both of them, they're among the few penguins that can lay more eggs in the same season. In the extreme northeast of Georgia, on a small beach along Cooper's Sound, other penguins have also formed their breeding colony, the chin-strap penguins. This is the southernmost colony of the species, and the only one on South Georgia. But every year, almost 2,000 couples come here to bring the next generation into the world. Like the Gen 2 penguins, the chin-strap penguins must also protect their eggs from the strong prevailing winds. But they're not quite as skilled architects as their relatives. They make use of pebbles and the bones of the dead of their species and stones to fortify their nests, but in a disordered manner, and making do with just a few dozen stones, enough to prevent the egg from rolling away. The hasty, slapdash way in which they build their nests is perhaps simply another adaptation to life in the colony, because while their relatives had to worry about their eggs being stolen by the brown skuas, here the enemy comes from within. The chin-strap penguins frequently steal each other's eggs, and when 2 neighbors join forces, imitating the technique used by the skuas, they can pose a serious threat to the owner of the nest. In the Antarctic region, terra firma is a scarce and vital resource. Every square foot of land free from ice is a treasure, and so there is fierce competition among the many animals that arrive from the sea. For the fur seals, life in the vast Scotia Sea is calm and uneventful. But when the breeding season comes, they need a plot of land on which to mate and give birth. And on the beaches of Georgia, space is in short supply. The first males arrive at the end of September and lay claim to plots of around 60 square meters. But at the end of December, the island plays host to almost 3 million fur seals. Then the plots are no larger than 22 square meters, and as a consequence, aggressiveness among the owners increases. The chest of the males is protected by the density of their fur and a thick layer of fat, but their extremities, bare and with a great many blood vessels, are dangerous weak points, and the teeth of the fur seals are formidable weapons. Even in the summer, life in South Georgia remains on the edge of the impossible. Any false move can have serious consequences, and a wound inflicted by an opponent could open the door to death. One of the fur seals has lost the battle for life. The southern giant petrels have smelled the body from up in the air and immediately fly down in search of their food rations. In this land of implacable harshness, nothing is allowed to go to waste. Every source of energy is seized with the rapacity that comes from extreme necessity. The giant petrels also compete among each other, but only the males. The females, smaller in size, would always lose in the fight over the dead body, so they have adopted other tactics and feed on fish and invertebrates, which they catch in the sea. The males become the vultures of the Antarctic region. Like them, it is the hungriest animal that is the most aggressive, and so gets the food, until mouthful by mouthful, his aggressiveness wanes, and he finally cedes his place to another, hungrier bird. A way of competing without inflicting major damage and sharing out the food in this land where even in summer, the climate may demand your very last gasp of energy. All year round, the Furious Fifties blast the island. For the majority of the animals, there would be no place to shelter in the interior if it were not for the tussock grass, the largest plant in this inhospitable land. The patches of tussock grass become the most important ecological niche in Georgia. They provide adequate nesting sites, refuge, and even food supplies. From a hill near the sea, a light-mantled sooty albatross is looking for a mate. The tussock protects him, and it is here that he will build the nest. But first, he has to find a mate, and for an albatross, that is a very serious business, given that they mate for life. When the light-mantled sooty albatross come together, they try to synchronize the movements of their flights. For the rest of their lives, they will form stable couples. So with many years' practice, they manage increasingly perfect synchronization in their aerial acrobatics, until the two companions are like each other's shadows. A macaroni penguin curiously observes the flight of the albatross. In the 18th century, the English who traveled to Italy adopted the hairstyle fashionable there at the time, with a parting down the middle and two locks over the ears. By association, in England they were called macaroni, and when this species was discovered, the comparison was inevitable. The macaronis also seek the shelter of the grass in which to lay their eggs. The plants protect them from the wind, providing a decent nesting site as well as the construction material. They're very gregarious, and in South Georgia there are around 5.5 million couples. But though gregarious, the macaronis also have terrible tempers. Another fight for a place on the island. Individual fights are not the hardest test for the macaronis in search of a mate. Much more terrible is moving around among the groups of bachelors. Passing between these gangs is a harsh punishment from which some birds emerge seriously wounded. But the end justifies the means. Despite everything, the macaronis have made it to the island, and with their clumsy gait climb up this hill away from the beach to perform the most important task of their lives, to bring new penguins into the world, thereby perpetuating their genes. The Furious Fifties, which unrelentingly blast the island, are nonetheless welcomed by some species that breed on South Georgia. This wandering albatross chick exercises its wings, which have just recently acquired feathers. For this species, the wind is not an enemy to be beaten, but rather a vital ally when it comes to taking flight. With a wingspan of over 3.5 meters, they are the finest gliders in the Antarctic region. But their long, narrow wings are not designed for self-propulsion. And if the wind drops below 18 kilometers per hour, the wandering albatross are unable to fly. Year after year, the adults return to the same breeding site. After a long separation, the male who arrives a few days earlier sees his mate approaching. They no longer need perform the complex courtship of this species, a brief summary by way of greeting, and they are again closely united as in previous years. While others protect themselves from the wind, the albatross seek out its company. With the aid of the air currents, they can take off with just a couple of flaps of their wings, and once airborne, they become one with the wind. The air is their element, propelled by the wind with a dynamic glide requiring the minimum of energy. They travel alone across the seas of the extreme south and only return to land to breed. In order to feed their chicks, they're capable of traveling distances of up to 8,000 kilometers, carried only by the wind, silently losing themselves in the eternal immensity of the sea. Among the elephant seals, tension is growing. With the harems formed, the males who have not been able to claim a territory rapidly see their possibilities of breeding diminish, and there is increasing nervousness in the colonies. When they stop breastfeeding their pups, the females immediately mate again. But for the young, this is a time of great risks. The intruders constantly try to steal females and don't exactly watch their step as they flee from the dominant male. The little ones have had just 3 weeks in which to accumulate the fat, which will defend them from the climate and the colossal males, and many are simply crushed to death at this time. The same fat that protects many of the animals of the frozen Antarctic latitudes was also the cause of their tragedy. When Captain Cook brought back reports of the enormous population of marine mammals on this remote island after landing there in 1775, he set a goal for the hunters. Elephant seals, fur seals, penguins, and whales became a much sought-after treasure. And it was the whales that suffered most. The Norwegian Carl Anton Larsen, responsible for the first whale harpooned in South Georgia, convinced the bankers of Buenos Aires to finance a whaling industry on the island. And in 1904, Breathtaking was opened, the first of many whaling stations that would process whales along the coasts of Georgia. From the time the first one was harpooned in these waters until the whaling industry in Georgia came to an end, 175,250 whales were processed in the factories of the island. Then there were no more cetaceans left in the Scotia Sea, and the whaling industry collapsed. Today, Breathtaking is a ghost town, a silent cemetery bearing testimony to the history of these southern lands. The old whaling ships rest at the place where they last unloaded. Time has taken the men away, but the story of their hard, long-suffering lives lies rusting among shipwrecks and abandoned ruins. The oil tanks, the houses of the whalers, the ships and the factories, everything appears to be sleeping, dreaming of distant days of survival and atrocious slaughters. On the outskirts of Breathtaking there is, however, a place which commemorates another, more glorious history, an everlasting monument to the great triumphs of which the human spirit is capable. This is the tomb of Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton. After 2 failed attempts to reach the South Pole, Shackleton decided to try to be the first to cross the Antarctic on foot. In the British press, he wrote, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Those were heroic times. Of the 5,000 men who replied, Shackleton selected 27 and set off on board the Endurance in August 1914. But that year proved to be particularly cold in the far south. The Weddell Sea froze over, trapping the ship. They were immobilized barely 160 kilometers from the Antarctic coast, and that calamity would mark the beginning of perhaps the greatest polar feat in history. They were drifting in an enormous ice floe, which was gradually breaking apart. For 9.5 months, the Endurance lived up to its name in its icy prison, but then it could endure no more. With the ship sunk, Shackleton set himself just one goal: to save the lives of all his men. A year and 4 months after starting their journey, after 5 months adrift in an ice floe and 7 days sailing in 2 small lifeboats, the boss, as his men called him, left the majority of his men on Elephant Island and set off with 5 crew members for South Georgia. In a boat measuring just 7 meters, they traveled 200 kilometers across the most violent waters in the world and made it to the coast of the island. Their odyssey continued. Enormous mountains covered in glaciers blocked their way, but Shackleton remained determined and with 2 of his men crossed the island, arriving at the whaling station of Stromness. He had achieved nothing short of a miracle. A few months later, Shackleton rescued the rest of his men. They had spent 2 years lost in that frozen hell, but they were all still alive. Today, 2 people have become the guardians of the story of this forgotten island. After traveling around the world in a small sailing ship, Pauline and Tim Carr, the only 2 permanent inhabitants of South Georgia, now dedicate all their efforts to conserving the Breathtaking Whaling Museum, with a spirit akin to that of those great travelers captivated by wild nature. Opposite the old jetty, the museum run by the Carrs commemorates a now forgotten way of life. The men, the objects, the whaling industry, and the great feats of exploration are the subjects of this small museum. But the history of man in South Georgia is not restricted to Grytviken, and the few visitors that travel around the island can find it concealed in the bays and coves of its coasts. In Ocean Harbor, the Bayard rests forever. For over 40 years, it was a whaling ship until a storm cast it ashore in this solitary bay. Since then, it has remained here. The cormorants of Georgia are now its crew. Tussock has taken root on the deck, and the birds use it to build their nests on, taking advantage of the grass and the shelter provided by the hull against the wind and the egg thieves. The past of the Bayard is gradually being stripped away. On the same deck where once whales were ripped apart, now new generations of cormorants are born, and little by little, the violent memory of our species fades. The hunters that came to Georgia in search of skins or whales also left their trace behind in the interior of the island, and not only in the form of ruined buildings. Reindeer at the edge of the Antarctic. They were introduced by the Norwegian seamen that ventured to these distant latitudes. For them, the reindeer represented a supply of fresh meat which brought back memories of their homeland. In 1911, 3 males and 7 females were introduced. This was the first of a series of introductions that were carried out until 1925. The descendants of those first reindeer, over 2,000, now graze in South Georgia. Scientists have recently studied whether it would be a good idea to eliminate them, fearing that animals introduced by man could significantly alter the ecosystem. But the studies have reached surprising conclusions. On the one hand, the reindeer of Georgia conserve the purest genetic strain of reindeer still remaining in Europe. And on the other hand, the 2 existing populations on the island have not colonized new areas since they were first introduced. The coasts of Georgia are the perfect habitat for these animals accustomed to the cold tundra of Finland and Norway. But inland Georgia remains impregnable territory. Two large barriers block the way into the interior. To one side, enormous mountains sharply rise up, with peaks of up to 3,000 meters. The other barrier is the ice. Over half of South Georgia is permanently covered in ice and snow. Enormous glaciers cover the interior, making life impossible. Only on the coast, in the shelter of bays and coves, is the solid land uncovered for several months a year, permitting the proliferation of those species capable of adapting to the harsh weather conditions. This one is a true specialist, standing on its claws to avoid heat loss from contact with the frozen ground. The king penguins recover after the molting season in St. Andrews Bay. Shortly before nesting, the king penguins shed their feathers, so for a short while they lose their thermal insulation. Molting and breeding are the 2 most critical moments in the annual cycle of these penguins, and if they do both at the same time, it is precisely because they have to wait until the warmest months. From November, the climate becomes milder. The coasts of Georgia are now free of snow, and in certain bays, the king penguins gather to form impressive breeding colonies. The chicks of the previous year still remain in the same place where they were born. Covered in a thick brown coat of feathers, they have had to withstand months of fasting over the winter, when their parents fed them only once every 5 or 6 weeks. This miracle of survival has been possible thanks to their fat reserves and the extraordinary coat that covers them. And now, with the improvement in the weather, their parents return, ready to feed them until they become independent. For a chick, surviving the winter in South Georgia, alone and without food, is an almost impossible test. But the king penguins, along with their incredible physiology, also have a very efficient social strategy. They form nurseries. A few weeks after the chicks are born, the adults leave them in the colony in noisy nurseries while they go off fishing again, and so recover the reserves lost during molting and incubating the eggs. The rivers that come from the glaciers in the interior are a fast, easy way to reach the ocean for the birds that are so clumsy on land, and almost all the adults use them to return to the fishing grounds. While the parents go off in search of food, the chicks patiently wait, surrounded by their neighbors, who give them not only body heat, but also protection against possible enemies. But when the parents return, they have a terrible problem. Each one has to locate its chick. There are thousands of them, and all of them dressed in the same brown uniform. Being territorial helps them to restrict the area in which to search, and once in their territory, they use individual calls, which are different for each penguin. The colony is in constant movement, with parents leaving to fish and returning to feed their young. At first sight, there seems to be very little activity, but if we speed up the images, we can see that quite the opposite is true. The chicks do not stray far from their territories to make it easier for the adults to locate them. But the parents come and go continuously until, at over 1 year old, the chicks become independent. Until then, and despite their nurseries, the little king penguins are exposed to serious dangers. Up in the sky, the brown skuas constantly fly over the nurseries. From the air, they keep watch in search of eggs, newborn chicks, or ones from the previous year that are ill or show some sign of weakness. They know that sooner or later death will claim another victim in the colony. If they don't spot food from up in the air, they choose a lookout point and wait, because the penguins share their beaches with a dangerous killer. There are also elephant seals scattered along the colony of king penguins on the beaches of St. Andrews Bay. Normally, they're peaceful, indifferent to their noisy neighbors, but the problems begin when a lone male desperately approaches a harem which already has an owner. Time is running out. It is very late in the season, and they now have very little possibility of forming a harem of their own. And so there remains no other alternative but to fight. For the chicks, the elephant seals and their clashes are simply one more inexplicable form of behavior in a world which is still unfamiliar to them, and so these strange living rocks arouse their curiosity. And in this case, curiosity can be fatal to the chicks, because throughout the mating season, the huge elephant seals often have to make hurried getaways. The elephant seals also injure each other. This male's wounds will take months to heal over, but among such enormous animals, there are rarely more serious consequences. It is the chicks and pups of their own and other species that die by the dozen, crushed on the beaches. Whenever there is a dispute among the large males, there are always observers watching out for collateral damage. It's simply a question of waiting, and sooner or later, a victim will appear. As they swoop down, the brown skuas broadcast the message of their find, and it's not long before other hopeful diners arrive. This time, the elephant seals have crushed a young fur seal. Using their hooked beaks and sharp nails, unique among web-footed birds, in just a few minutes, the brown skuas have torn all the meat from the little body. By the time a giant petrel gets there, it's too late. Though it is stronger than the skuas, its beak is not as thin and precise as theirs, so he can get virtually nothing from the remains. For a few minutes, it establishes its authority over the body, keeping the skuas at bay. But his booty is now useless to him, and the skuas, who know this, patiently wait until their adversary leaves the way free for them. Again, there are continuous disputes over the body, for the last strips of meat, and unlike the giant petrels, here it is the females, who are bigger in size, that get the choicest morsels. Death is a daily occurrence along the coasts of South Georgia. On an island without large predators, it seems paradoxical that death can come from crushing, cold, or abandonment. But in a land of such extreme conditions, the death of a few permits the life of many. While directing his second Antarctic expedition in 1938, the explorer Richard E. Byrd wrote, "After observing the sky for a long time, I came to the conclusion that such beauty was reserved for distant, dangerous places, and that nature has good reasons to demand special sacrifices from those determined to contemplate it." That is the nature of this island lost in the Scotia Sea. Harsh and violent, subjected to extreme conditions, yet providing a home to dozens of wild species. Whether they be humans, animals, or plants, all the inhabitants of South Georgia must undergo constant tests of survival. That is the price of this forbidden paradise, a land dominated by savage nature. Shackleton's life was guided by the motto on his family shield, "From endurance we overcome." Here, on this solitary lost island, the ferocious winds perpetuate the motto. They would seem to be a punishment in this remote corner of the world, and yet all the flourishing life on the island, in considerable measure, owes its protection, and thus its survival, to the unrelenting blast of these Furious Fifties.